On September 26, 2024, Florida braced for Hurricane Helene. It arrived as a Category 4 monster, making landfall with 140 miles per hour winds, tearing apart entire neighborhoods and killing 34 people before most believed the nightmare was over. But the storm did not die at the coast. It moved inland, gathering power for a second and deadlier strike no one saw coming. How did a storm rewrite the meaning of safety? And why were the mountains not safe after all? At 11:10 p.m., the world changed for Florida's Big Bend. Hurricane Helene, a Category 4 storm with winds of 140 miles per hour, crashed ashore near Perry. The ocean did not just rise, it attacked. A wall of water, 15 feet high, surged over the coast, swallowing everything in its path. Entire neighborhoods vanished beneath the waves. Homes, some anchored for generations, were ripped from their foundations and carried deep into the marshes. Boats meant for the Gulf ended up stranded in pine forests, wedged against uprooted oaks. The surge swept through Keaton Beach and Steinhatchee, leaving only splintered pilings where houses once stood. In the darkness, families scrambled to higher ground as the sound of shattering glass and twisting metal filled the air. Emergency calls overloaded the system. First responders, themselves in danger, reported streets erased, landmarks gone, and entire blocks reduced to debris fields. As the surge pressed inland, it did not stop with small towns. Farther south, Tampa Bay faced its own reckoning. Water poured into the city, rising 6 to 8 feet above normal in some neighborhoods. Cars floated down avenues. Storefronts became aquariums. Power failed. Streetlights flickered out, leaving only the roar of the wind and the relentless push of water. By dawn, the scale of destruction was clear. 34 people had lost their lives in Florida alone. The coast was left scarred, with boats tossed like toys and houses scattered like driftwood. For the families who survived, the storm's power was not just a story. It was the memory of a night when the ocean came home. And yet, as Florida counted its dead and surveyed the wreckage, Helene was not finished. The hurricane's next move would defy every expectation. Tampa Bay had always lived with the threat of hurricanes, but Helene delivered something different. As the storm's core pressed north, its reach swept far beyond the Big Bend. In the hours after midnight, water began pouring into Tampa's neighborhoods, rising through storm drains and over seawalls. By the time the tide gauge at Ballast Point reached its peak, parts of the city were under 6 to 8 feet of water, levels not seen in a generation. Bayshore Boulevard, usually lined with joggers and cyclists, vanished beneath churning waves. Downtown streets filled with salt water, swallowing cars and flooding ground floor businesses. Fire crews waded through waist-deep water, checking stranded homes where residents had ignored evacuation orders. City officials struggled to keep up as the crisis unfolded. Power failed across wide swaths of Tampa and St. Petersburg. With cell towers down, emergency calls dropped or never connected. In some neighborhoods, families climbed to second floors or rooftops, watching the lights go out one by one across the city. By dawn, the full scale of the disaster was visible. Boats bobbed in parking lots. Yachts rested against brick buildings. The Tampa Bay Times later reported that at least 34 Floridians died in the storm, many trapped by flooding or struck by debris as homes collapsed. In the aftermath, stunned city workers began the slow task of accounting for the missing and clearing roads blocked by overturned vehicles and downed power lines. The state's fatality sheet told the story in numbers: 34 lives lost, each one a family changed forever. For Tampa Bay, Helene's surge was a reminder that even cities built for hurricanes can be overwhelmed. As the sun rose, residents believed the worst was over. But Helene was not done. The storm's path pointed inland, toward places that had never expected to face the ocean's fury. Hurricane Helene did not behave like any storm meteorologists expected. After slamming into Florida, most believed it would weaken quickly. as nearly every hurricane does once it loses the warm fuel of the ocean. Instead, Helene tore across Georgia, still packing the power of a Category 2 hurricane, with winds topping 110 miles per hour in some areas. Satellite images from the National Hurricane Center showed a storm core that stayed shockingly intact, its massive wind field stretching over hundreds of miles. Meteorologists tracking Helene's progress noted how little it slowed. The storm raced through southern Georgia at nearly 25 miles per hour, far faster than most hurricanes. This rapid forward motion kept its circulation tight and its rain bands organized, allowing hurricane-force gusts to reach deep into the interior, farther than most storms ever manage. Even as Helene crossed into the Piedmont and foothills, the wind field remained broad, with damaging gusts recorded as far north as central South Carolina and into western North Carolina. But Helene's real weapon was not just its wind. The storm carried an extraordinary amount of tropical moisture, more, according to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration reanalysis, than any hurricane in the region's modern record. Weather balloons launched in Georgia and the Carolinas measured atmospheric water vapor at levels never before observed for an inland-moving cyclone. Helene's plume of moisture, drawn from the Gulf and the Caribbean, was funneled straight into the southern Appalachians by a stalled frontal boundary and a low-level jet stream. Rainfall models predicted disaster, but even those forecasts fell short. The combination of a fast-moving core, a sprawling wind field, and record moisture set the stage for what would become a catastrophic inland flood. As Helene barreled toward the mountains, meteorologists struggled to warn communities that had always believed themselves safe from hurricanes. The storm was about to deliver its second and far deadlier blow. Asheville sits 2,000 feet above the Carolina lowlands, tucked into the Blue Ridge Mountains. For years, it was the city people ran to when the coast felt unsafe. No hurricanes, no sea level rise, no triple-digit heat waves. National magazines and relocation blogs called it a climate haven, a place where the worst disasters happened somewhere else. Real estate agents leaned into the promise and advertised Asheville as a sanctuary above the flood line. The city's population swelled, driven by newcomers from Florida, South Carolina, and the Gulf Coast, all looking for a safer place to raise their families. Home prices soared, neighborhoods filled with people who believed the mountains were a natural shield against the chaos below. City planners and officials welcomed the growth, even as they scrambled to keep up with demand. Water systems, roads, and emergency services stretched to serve the growing population. For many, the biggest worry was whether there would be enough houses, not whether those houses could survive a storm. The city's own marketing leaned on the idea of resilience, presenting Asheville as a steady, cool refuge in a changing world. Local advisories rarely mentioned hurricanes at all. Instead, the focus was on wildflowers, mountain views, and a climate that seemed immune to the disasters battering the rest of the Southeast. But the idea of safety was more than just a slogan. It shaped how people lived. Families bought homes in river valleys, confident that distance from the ocean meant safety from the sea. Emergency plans focused on snowstorms, not tropical floods. Few residents worried about the risk of losing basic services. That confidence vanished overnight. When Helene's rain began to fall, the city's water system, built for a different kind of disaster, couldn't keep up. Landslides cut off treatment plants. Pipes burst under the weight of debris. Within hours, taps ran dry or poured out water too dirty to drink. The city issued a boil water alert for nearly every neighborhood. For days, and in some places weeks, people lined up for bottled water, hauling jugs home from fire stations and church parking lots. The promise of a climate haven was replaced by the reality of a city unprepared for the ocean to arrive by river. Rain gauges in western North Carolina began to fail under the weight of numbers they were never designed to record. In Busick, a remote station in Yancey County, the logbook tells the story. It recorded 30.78 inches of rain in less than 4 days. The staff scientist who checked the equipment thought at first it was a mistake. No official gauge in this part of the Appalachians had ever seen a number that high. Mount Mitchell, the highest peak east of the Mississippi, recorded 24.2 inches, its weather station battered by wind and water, but still transmitting data until the power finally cut out. Maps from the National Weather Service showed bands of color so dark they looked like errors, stretching from the South Carolina border up into the Black Mountains. In one corridor, the rainfall totals outpaced anything from the infamous Francis and Ivan storms of 2004, nearly double their combined peaks, but in a fraction of the time. QPE radar estimates, usually reliable, struggled to keep up. Local climatologists called it a 1 in 1,000 year rainfall, language normally reserved for events you expect to see only in technical papers. The numbers from Busick and Mount Mitchell were not isolated. Dozens of other stations in the Blue Ridge and Silo Knob region logged over 20 inches. Asheville's airport, which had never recorded more than 10 inches in a 3-day stretch, reported nearly 14 inches before its instruments failed. For days, the rain fell without pause, soaking hillsides and valleys already saturated by earlier storms. By the time Helene's core reached the mountains, the ground was primed for disaster. Water had nowhere to go but downhill, and the rivers below were about to face a test not seen in living memory. The state climatologist later described it as the kind of event you might only expect to read about in a technical paper, not in the real world. It was a convergence of tropical moisture, stalled weather systems, and mountain terrain that turned the sky into a fire hose. The gauges broke records, and then the rivers began to rise. The French Broad River had always been the city's quiet boundary, a line that separated neighborhoods from the wooded hills beyond. On the morning of September 28th, that boundary disappeared. USGS gauges at Asheville recorded the river cresting at 24.67 feet, breaking the 1916 record by 1.5 feet. The Swannanoa River, usually a winding creek through backyards and parks, surged to 26 feet, more than twice its normal flood stage. USGS hydrographs traced a line that shot upward, then leveled off only after entire blocks had vanished. From the air, the transformation was absolute. Where streets and rooftops had stood, now only brown water stretched to the horizon. Chimney Rock, a town that built its identity around a stone spire and a single main street, was left in ruins. Lake Lure, famous for its calm waters and summer cabins, disappeared beneath a churning inland sea. Swannanoa, a working-class community tucked between ridges, was erased. Residents watched as homes, businesses, and churches were carried away, some floating for miles before breaking apart against bridges or trees. Hot Springs, once a quiet mountain retreat, was cut off on all sides. Its only connection to the outside world was now a helicopter or a desperate radio call. In Biltmore Village, floodwaters reached the rooftops, leaving only the highest windows visible. The River Arts District, a hub for creativity and music, was reduced to piles of tangled lumber and scattered canvases. For those who stayed, the loss was not just physical. Generations of history, family photos, heirlooms, the smell of a favorite bakery were swept away in hours. Survivors described the sound of water breaking through walls, the shock of seeing neighbors' houses float by, and the helplessness of watching everything familiar dissolve into the current. Entire communities vanished, not just on the map, but in memory. The rivers that had shaped these towns for centuries now defined their end. In the space of a single night, the promise of safety in the mountains was replaced by the reality that nothing could stand against the flood. Nearly 2,000 landslides tore through the mountains in the wake of Helene's rain. Steep slopes gave way in the middle of the night, sending whole hillsides crashing down onto homes, roads, and rivers. Some slides moved so fast they buried houses before anyone could react. Others peeled away layers of highway, leaving gaping scars where pavement had stood for decades. Interstate 40, a lifeline connecting Asheville to Tennessee, collapsed into the Pigeon River in several places. Entire sections of Interstate 26 vanished, cutting Asheville off from South Carolina. Smaller mountain roads disappeared beneath mud and broken trees, trapping entire towns with no way in or out. With every route blocked, help could not reach those stranded in the valleys. Emergency managers turned to the air. National Guard helicopters ferried supplies and rescue teams over peaks and into isolated communities. In places where even helicopters could not land, teams loaded food and medicine onto mules and sent them along old trails. Starlink terminals dropped in by air became the only way some towns could communicate with the outside world. For days, rescue pilots navigated through cloud and debris, searching for signs of life below. The mountains, once a refuge, became a maze of broken ground and vanished roads, a landscape where every mile had to be won back, one flight at a time. Michael Dry, just 7 years old, clung to his grandfather's hand as floodwaters rose around their Asheville home. Neighbors watched from higher ground, powerless to help, as the family huddled on their rooftop. The river, swollen far beyond its banks, tore the house from beneath them. All three, Michael, his grandfather, and his grandmother, were swept away in the current. Their bodies were found days later, one story among hundreds of families who would never return home. Across the region, the lights went out. At the peak, nearly 2 million customers lost power from Florida to Virginia. Cell towers toppled, leaving entire towns cut off. Hospitals faced a new crisis as the Baxter North Cove plant, a major source of IV fluids for the nation, was disabled by flood and landslide. With production halted for weeks and full recovery months away, hospitals began rationing IV bags, echoing supply shortages last seen after Hurricane Maria. By the time the waters receded, Helene had killed well over 150 people across 6 states. North Carolina bore the greatest loss, with more than 100 lives ended far from any ocean. The economic cost soared past $50 billion, and experts warned that the true toll, counting uninsured losses and broken supply chains, could climb much higher. For families like the Drys, and for a nation that felt the shock ripple from hospital wards to kitchen tables, the cost could never be measured in numbers alone. Today, more than 120 North Carolinians remain unaccounted. This is proof that disaster can find us anywhere. As climate extremes intensify, safe zones are vanishing from the map. Communities once seen as refuges now face threats they never imagined. The next storm won't ask where you moved to escape, it just asks if you're ready. Share your thoughts below.